Thank you. First of all, my thanks goes to the Council of Young Scholars at the Faculty of Sociology and then the Center for German and European Studies, and special thanks to Anicia and her organizational skills who made it actually possible that I'm here with you today and able to present my results on bike activism in Belgrade and also to exchange knowledge. As you can see from the title of my presentation, I'm going to deal with the meaning of space and spatial strategies in Belgrade's bike activism. And the topic of my presentation is part of a broader research project in which I analyze urban activist groups, urban movements in Belgrade. And these urban movements have been created mostly within the last 5 years. And they take up very different issues that are connected to life in the city, such as the appropriation of abandoned spaces, saving green areas and parks, or the limitation of access to public space for marginalized groups. In this presentation, however, I will concentrate on activist groups and individuals who direct their engagement towards the promotion of cycling in the capital. And before discussing the actual topic, which is the meaning of space and the spatial strategies, I will briefly explain the general situation for cyclists in Belgrade and then give you a short overview of the bike activist scene. So, well, in terms of statistics, Belgrade can be hardly called a bicycle city, especially when looking at the hard facts. Various local studies shows that the share of bicycles in public traffic is rather low, as you can see here from the slides. So far, only 65.5 kilometers of bike infrastructure have been built on the territory of whole Belgrade, with the majority of bike paths existing in the flat areas of the city, which are the municipalities of New Belgrade and Zeman, which are not in the city center. And the construction of additional infrastructure that connects the outskirts of Belgrade with the city center, or that would allow for safe traffic with the city, is still lacking. And very often the bike paths are either in a bad condition, that means they have damages in the asphalt, or are blocked by cars, by parked cars or small kiosks. So that is a big barrier for people who either cycle or would like to cycle. And instead, cycling in Belgrade is mostly perceived as a leisure activity or sport, and less as a mode of commuting by inhabitants, local inhabitants, the city authorities and planners alike. So, and this stance that cycling is not a way of commuting, of daily commuting in the city, is exemplified by the fact that the most recent bike infrastructure has been built to connect the existing recreational zones in the city. And in official documents, cycling is either viewed altogether with walking or with the use of motorcycles. And another interesting fact is that although official documents acknowledge the need for traffic regulations or infrastructure to increase the safety of cyclists, no further recommendations or strategies are defined. Here is another slide showing you statistics that the majority of Belgraders refrain from using the bike simply because there is no bike infrastructure in the city, or because it is regarded as insecure, unsafe. I also prepared some pictures for today. Here you can see that although there is bike infrastructure in the area of New Belgrade, it is really on the one side dangerous, or it is not very easy to use the bike because of cracks in the asphalt or holes, or because there is no consistent planning of bike infrastructure, as you can see here, which is a very typical example of how cycling is perceived actually by local authorities. So that is the condition for cycling in Belgrade, which gives the broader background for people's engagement in bike-related activism and groups. And the bike activism in Belgrade is characterized by the existence of different actors such as associations, informal communities of people, as well as individuals. And it's quite difficult to map all the actors for this presentation, so I just gave you the info on 4 of the most prominent bike associations, which are listed here. I won't go into detail for that, but interestingly, there have been already efforts by activists to promote cycling in the city back in the 1990s and at the beginning of the 21st century. But the bike activist scene has considerably grown and developed since the organization of the first critical mass in Belgrade in the spring of 2011. And since I don't know if the critical mass event, the critical mass is something that is known to you. I mean, it's, yes, it is. Anissa says yes, so. I go on. The critical mass is also organized in Belgrade on a monthly basis, and it is stressed that it is a peaceful action by which the bike activists demonstrate their presence in traffic. So that was the major boost for the bike activist scene to develop in Belgrade. And now I would like, since my results are based on fieldwork, I would like to give you a short episode from the field, which is a certain event which was called the Orange Bike Ride, which took place in June 2013 as part of a bigger festival which was called Beograd Velograd, so Belgrade Cycling City, if I translate it. And this festival was initiated by a Dutch who had moved to Belgrade and started offering bike tours through the capital. And the festival aimed at increasing public awareness towards the bike as a means of urban lifestyle and thus promoting cycling in the city. In order to attract people's attention and show cyclists' presence in traffic, the route of that bike ride was planned to start from Ušće, that is an urban area which is located in New Belgrade on the mouth of the rivers Sava and Danube, so it's a recreational area. And the route was planned to pass over one of Belgrade's most prominent bridges, which is Branko's Bridge, and then should lead to the city center and through the city center. And it should end in front of Skupština, the House of National Assembly of Serbia, which symbolically can be seen as the heart of the city and also Serbian nation. The announcement of the event had attracted quite a heterogeneous group of people, and it was on the one hand dozens of activists, which were members of various bike groups, initiatives and associations, which had joined the event, since the bike ride coincided with the overall goal to show presence in traffic and in the city. And on the other hand, many others had come to enjoy the ride through the city center, its streets and boulevards, because the group ride seemed for many more secure and thus more fun for them than cycling just by themselves on the streets. And streets in Belgrade, as they are in St. Petersburg, they are normally congested by motorized traffic. And also a lot of parents had come to take part in the bike ride with the children and using the opportunity for a family outing through the city. So that is also something which is very unusual, that parents take the children and take a bike ride through the city, which is something Belgraders just don't do. And the reference to the color orange was made because the embassy of the Netherlands financially supported the bike ride, so it has nothing to do with the Orange Revolution, but with the Netherlands, maybe some factor that is important to give you the context of the event. So what happened was, while the crowd was waiting for the bike ride to start, 2 police cars were arriving and parked in some distance to the group of participants, which had by now increased to more than 400, quite a big number for Belgrade. And shortly after that, the organizer of the festival turned to the crowd, welcomed the participants, and announced that the route had to be changed, and thus would not lead to the expected endpoint, Skupština. And he also referred that the route had been planned long beforehand, and had also been agreed upon by the city authorities, but as it is in Belgrade, the organizers were informed about the ban of these plans just the night before. Also very typical for Belgrade. Instead, the bike ride would lead around Ušće, so the recreational area, which did not only represent a physical but also a symbolical ban of cyclists from the city center. And I mean, it's very understanding that the participants reacted very strongly to these announcements, and especially since they confirmed the overall perception that cyclists are not viewed as equal participants in traffic by the city government. So shouts were directed towards the police force, whose mere bodily presence now marked the control of space by the city government. And in fact, many participants of the Orange Bike Ride voiced a disappointment with the change of the route, which was now much shorter than the originally planned one, and also limited to the area of Ušće recreational zone. And now on this new alternative route, the participants are riding the bikes on a by-road, which was hardly used by any motorized traffic, but used as a parking area for Belgraders who go to Ušće to take a stroll or visit one of the cafes that are located there. So in the eyes of many participants and activists, the bike ride merely failed to achieve its goals and demonstrate cyclists' presence on the streets of Belgrade, and also attract public attention, since there was simply no traffic to block and no people who would see the bike ride. That is also the reason why some participants preferred if the ban would have been ignored and the bike tour would have taken the original route, even if that option would have surely meant to get in trouble with the police. For some activists, the displacement of the bike tour reflected the city authorities' standpoint towards cycling-related issues, which for many was marked by ignorance and indifference. And they viewed the short-term ban of the bike tour as a purposeful act of the city to keep control over space and to keep the cyclists marginal. And which also happened was that rumors of the actual reasons for the ban started to circulate among the participants during the bike ride, and the rumors were that the police wanted to be paid for blocking the streets. So that was the rumors that circulated, and that added to the outspoken, or more reflected the outspoken negative image which people hold of city authorities and city administration in Belgrade. So the cyclists were not merely prohibited from riding the bikes to the city center in the course of the bike ride, but the presence of the police also physically reinforced the ban. And here you can see a picture from the start of the bike ride, which was really on that by-road that was used by no one except the cyclists. And here you can see the police blocking one of the streets to make sure that the cyclists are not leaving the by-road and controlling the space. So during the bike ride, the police cars were accompanying the group of cyclists, one car in front and one in the back, to ensure that cyclists were not leaving the approved road, and perceiving them as a potential threat to the order of the traffic and thus the city, the police also stayed until the end of the bike ride, observing the cyclists. So the bike ride or bike events such the Orange Bike Ride manifest the existing power relations in Serbia between the state and citizens by spatializing them. So what I mean by that is that the exertion of power by the state and city government is embedded spatially by deciding actually who is granted access to and use of public space. The organization of bike events is indeed very often met with suspicion on behalf of city authorities, especially because cyclists are conceptualized as a potentially dangerous group which is perceived and declared to disturb public order, peace and motorized traffic. And the denial to allow cyclists, which are perceived as an undesired and potentially threatful group, their right to move freely within the city and to appropriate space is legitimized by references to the law, and here in this regard the law on public peace and order, and also the obligation of the state to secure public safety. And furthermore, as we have seen in the example of the Orange Bike Ride, the exertion of power is enforced by the police and the communal police, which control and regulate that urban space is used according to that law. And in doing so, they determine not only who is an undesired group, but also they determine the boundaries of urban space to which these groups are allowed or not allowed. So the police actually ensure the spatial marginality of cyclists, both in a geographical and in a symbolic sense. And investigating the meaning of space and spatial strategies within Belgrade's urban activism, I argue to view space as a category with multiple dimensions. So space is the field where the transition and power relations are being experienced and interpreted, but it's also where the activists' activities are located. So that is somehow the theoretical framework to what I've talked and what I will explain or discuss now. In this regard, I also want to add a further dimension of space as a field of action that enables activists to regain agency and break away from something that is very prominent in Serbia. A lot of people talk about Serbia being in crisis, something that society, politics are not functioning normal. And by their bike activism and by the appropriation of space, they somehow manage to regain agency and break away from this perception of an omnipotent crisis. Well, looking at the meaning of space, Belgrade urban activists articulate multiple claims for space in the city, which they emphasize by direction. And what I mean by that is that the claims for space both refer to the built material structure, but also to a symbolic quality of space. So regarding the built material structure, it's bike infrastructure, bike paths, bike racks, traffic-calmed areas, which they claim that they need. And these structural measures are seen as fundamental to increase cyclists' situations in the city, but they have to be complemented by a political recognition of cyclists. So meaning that the public awareness towards cyclists has to change and it needs more sensibility towards them, which I conceive as the symbolic quality of space. So to be recognized as equal road users by other traffic and authorities was pointed out by all activists as their utmost concern. And very often when talking about themselves, bike activists or cyclists said that they are merely invisible in the city and they don't have any space in the city. And in their claim to reclaim space, the activists adopt various different strategies. For instance, their bodies and their movement are decisive instruments to show presence in space. And here I draw on Edward Casey, who has pointed out that there is actually an interconnection between body, place, and motion, because, I quote, lived bodies belong to places and help to constitute them, and further places belong to lived bodies. So the mutual relation of bodies and places for experience and placemaking is also apparent in activists' accounts on the importance of what they call being in place. So for them it is very important to actually be in place, be in traffic. The importance of being in place and showing presence was confirmed by their statements. And indeed, being cyclist in Belgrade, and I don't know about what it is like in St. Petersburg, but in Belgrade, being cyclist, it meant to experience insecurity and danger. So cyclists were, as they said, always regarded as freaks. They were being cut off by motorized road users. They were getting shouted at or even injured. And even I took the bike in Belgrade to experience what it is like to ride a bike there, and I have to admit that it is an interesting experience. Let's put it that way. Interesting. And this bodily experience of insecurity and danger became an integral part of their cyclist identity. So due to the dangers of being cyclist in Belgrade, it means that every time when someone was taking the bike, using the bike, it meant that people were making a statement, if they wanted to or not. So it means that you were making a statement no matter if you were taking part in the critical mass or just taking a bike to the supermarket. And following that, the cyclists also deliberately used their bodies to claim space in traffic. And one cyclist emphasized that by saying that you just have to be dauntless to make place for yourself. And here I quote him, he said that, "I like to piss them off." He meant the car drivers, because then you get awareness and you have to fight for space. So now it gets theoretical again, because I draw on Tim Creswell in this regard, and he has pointed out that there are spatial boundaries, and they are used by institutions of power to maintain an established order. And Creswell further argues that the spatial boundaries are made between the ones who are in place and those who are out of place. And these boundaries are brought to the light through so-called transgressive acts. So when we come back to the bike activism in Belgrade, besides inserting the body in order to reappropriate space, I suggest to add a further dimension of transgressive acts, since space is also contested by the very act of movement through landscape. So here we are at one of the critical mass events in Belgrade, which always started off at one square in the city, which is the Republic Square. Also a square in the center of the city, very important because everything happens there, all the people meet there. And the cyclists show their presence in number by the bodies and the bikes. And what happens then, of course, is that they start to move through the city on a certain route. And when looking at the critical mass events, it's much more the interplay between moving from one place to others. So the critical mass events or the cyclists, they do not only move, but they stop at certain places to take pictures, and then they move on again. So it's an interplay between moving and stopping, sometimes even blocking traffic, even though they say they do not intend to, but still they do. And another way how activists manage to reclaim space is by the use of visual signs, and here I mean posters, banners, even self-made traffic signs or graffiti. And this visualization plays a central role in order to mark space and to deliver a quick and clear message. And here is another example of a very recent action, which is called in English Fight for Bridges. and it was initiated by 2 bike associations in Belgrade. And in their activity in this campaign, they tried to address the disastrous conditions on Belgrade's bridges. So the bridges are really full of cracks and holes, and it's simply not safe to go over one bridge. And so you're not able to come from the outskirts to the city center simply because you're not able to use the bridges on the bike. And that very action was in December 2013, when the activists enrolled a banner that said, repair the pavement on Pančevo Bridge, which was that bridge. And it was accompanied by other actions on other bridges, where they tried to draw public attention to the conditions of the bridges. And while bike events such as the Orange Bike Ride or the Critical Mass reappropriate place only temporarily, bike activists also claim and aim at the production of permanent places, like this one, which was back then a garage, but was supposed to become Belgrade's first bike kitchen. And I don't know if bike kitchen is a term that is, no. Bike kitchen is something that originated in the United States, where cyclists tried to find places for their own, where the bike community could meet, where they could repair the bikes, where they could exchange skills and knowledge. And this garage was meant to become Belgrade's first bike kitchen. And actually it was opened last month, so in May 2014, where they actually managed to establish the bike kitchen, which is meant as an open place for cyclists. And there is also another one, which was the first place for cyclists in Belgrade, the Bike Info Center, also seen as a place for the bike community. And the aim behind that is to develop a community that should grow together and become a critical mass in order to implement and push forward the bike activists' concerns. And looking at the activists' strategies of reappropriating urban space and placemaking, it is also necessary to discuss the meaning of locations in this process, and indeed the places of action, so the locations where they take place, are central, since places are always carriers of meaning, which the activists try to utilize, contest, or also add new meanings. And there are numerous locations where Belgrade's activists take action, such as, for instance, Republic Square, bridges, green areas, or streets. And the Orange Bike Ride and the cyclists' ban from the city center illustrates that the geographical location is indeed crucial for activists to step in place and to become central. And I have said that in the appropriation of space, bike activists also try to pick up the meanings of certain locations, but also to add new meanings. And one example I want to give you is that of Skanderbegova Street. It became the location of an event during the celebration of European Day of Mobility last year in September. And during that day, the cyclists tried to reclaim Skanderbegova Street by turning it into a place of fun and of a social get-together. The location, Skanderbegova Street, was chosen because it is a quiet street with only little traffic and a lot of trees, as you can see on this picture. And also the Bike Info Center, which I have mentioned before, is located at the beginning of this very street. So in celebration of that European Day of Mobility, they turned it into a temporary fun site for cyclists. As green space was improvised, as you can see here, on parking places, and rounded off by chairs and sunshades. And furthermore, the cyclists also took pictures with a handmade traffic sign that stated a 30 zone, which means a traffic-calmed area, which they hoped that the street and other streets would become in Belgrade. And last but not least, the cyclists also marked a temporary bike path on that street, which is a one-way street, so they hoped to become also, or to get a bike path in that street, which would allow safer traffic for the cyclists. So what they did is that they did not only transform this street temporarily, but they also added a new meaning to it. Instead of being reserved for motorized traffic and parking places, and we have a lot of parking places in Belgrade, and as here in St. Petersburg, you find cars everywhere, really everywhere, even on places where you don't expect them to be, and where they are not allowed to be actually. So they pointed out one message to the city, which is that the streets belong to everyone, and now we are here back at the title of the presentations, and that authorities and urban planners should move away from their fixation with cars, culture of cars, which they call it, and also respect pedestrians and cyclists. And to conclude, what I meant to do was to give you a short impression of the meaning of space and the spatial practices, strategies by activists in Belgrade. And the meaning of space is actually important and a central dimension to understand the urban movements in Belgrade. So having presented the Orange Bike Ride as an example for people's attempt to appropriate and claim urban space by means of their bodies and movement, my purpose was to shed light on the multiple dimensions of space, as I've already mentioned, a ground of interpretation and experience, and also the terrain where the activists' activities are actually located, where they take place. And banning the bike ride from Belgrade city center and Skupština demonstrates the city's authorities' articulation of power through the control of space. So in this sense, I also suggested to perceive the activists' reappropriation of space as a field where they are able to regain agency. And I think I will leave it by here. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm definitely looking forward for questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay, the floor is open for questions and comments. Okay.
First of all, thank you. And my question is about how long is it since the first bicycle paths appeared in Belgrade? Mm-hmm. And if there are data on it, was it a part of planned infrastructure, or it was just a single bicycle path in the middle of nowhere, not connected to other bicycle paths? So what was it like?
The construction of the bike infrastructure we have is limited to New Belgrade, and New Belgrade is somehow geographically separated from the city center, Stari Grad, because you have to pass one of the bridges to come to Stari Grad. And when New Belgrade was constructed during the socialist Tito's times, they also integrated the bike infrastructure. So it's already some time ago. And that was the only single attempt to implement a bike infrastructure, because this is flat area and cycling is perceived to be easier in flat area. And since then there was no serious attempt to introduce further bike infrastructure in the city center. And the only one that was actually constructed was on one of Belgrade's recreational zones, which is only around an artificial lake. So that is also connected to the perception that cycling is only for leisure and sport. So we don't have any bike infrastructure in the actual city center. And regarding the authorities' standpoint, there will not be any bike infrastructure in the near future.
And which decades are meant when you're talking about Novi Belgrade? Was you part of Belgrade?
It was mainly in the 70s.
70s.
Yeah.
That's interesting because Belgrade was a socialist city at the time, but in socialist cities in Ukraine, for example, there was no single feature of bicycle infrastructure, so even attempts and even some.
It is interesting because when we look at Belgrade's second largest city, which is Novi Sad, and in Novi Sad we have a huge bike infrastructure throughout the city, and Novi Sad was also built and reconstructed during Tito's times, and there the bike infrastructure was integrated as a part of the city outlook and the city architecture. And in Belgrade it's only limited to New Belgrade.
Other questions? I have two, if I may. Thank you very much for your very inspiring presentation. Sometimes I felt like you speak about St. Petersburg. We have
Interesting.
pictures are like taken from our landscapes. Yes, sometimes it looked very similar, sometimes not, because it's really surprising to hear about the socialist bike routes unbelievable in Russian cities. But I have two questions, rather not about cycling and not about cycling movement in Belgrade, but about the broader context. You spoke about the political dimension of this movement, and I would like you to speak maybe a little bit more about that and about the interaction of the activists with police and with the authorities, because it's somehow I missed it in your presentation. So what was actually the feedback? And I really liked the case with the orange bike ride, because it was so conflicting. I mean, you could see what actually happened, so how it is experienced. Because, and this is not my second question, but maybe my second comment, what is so specific about cycling activism? Because you speak that space is so important, but space is important not only for urban social movements, and of course not only for the cyclist movement, because we know that this phenomenon of Occupy movements throughout the world, it was very spatial. I mean, space is essential to even such movements that deal with economical problems and political problems, things like that. So first, the political context of the movement, and second, what is so specific about cycling?
Thank you very much for your question / comments. I think they are very important because I was not able to include the political dimension, which is indeed very important when looking at the urban or bike movement in Belgrade. The bike activism is one part of the urban movements I looked at. The other was activism for homeless people. And I also looked at LGBT activism, which was not the main focus of myself, but it was interesting to see how they are perceived differently. LGBT, so the homosexual gay movement in Belgrade, is a highly politicized topic issue. I don't know if you know that, but there is something like the Gay Pride March in Belgrade, which has been banned for the first consecutive year in 2013. So they were not able to actually march the streets as they planned to, because again, the city authorities regarded them as a safety issue. So when it comes to LGBT movement, it is they have the political claims, and it's highly politicized. Instead, when we look at the bike activism and also the other kind of activism I looked at, they also have the political claims. Of course, it is political what they do, but they don't perceive themselves as such. they claim for themselves that, we're just few citizens who take the matters in their own hands, and we are no political associations at all. We don't have any political claims, although they clearly do. So it is the apolitical dimension which is very important when looking at the urban movements in Belgrade, and that is related to the political situation which we have in Belgrade and in Serbia, because, and I think we both two have talked about it today, and I have mentioned it, Serbia is by many people perceived to be in crisis, and people say that, nothing functions here at all, especially not the way it should do. And during the 1990s there were a lot of anti-Milosevic movements, student protests against Milosevic, and the people really thought that the political opposition, which actually came to power after Milosevic was sieged, his regime was overthrown, that things would turn to the better, and that Serbia would lose its economic isolation and would soon become a member of the European Union. But this didn't turn out the way people hoped it would be. So they really got frustrated and disappointed with the whole political elite, so with all the political parties, and also with NGOs, because they were thought to be very close to political parties, which they perceived as corrupt, not trustful. So what the urban movements do now is they step back and they say we are not political at all, but they take up the political conditions which we have nowadays in Serbia. So that is an interesting play with how they perceive themselves, how they want to be perceived, and that is another dimension, they very much stress that they are just citizens, and in Serbian they say we are citizens, mi smo građani, which means on the one side we are the term građanin, which means urban dweller or from the city, or citizen. So they stress both dimensions of that term, and they say that due to the fact that we are living in Belgrade, that we are from Belgrade, we have a right to the city, we have the right to change the city. So that's the basis of their engagement, or how they legitimize their activism and their claims actually. And the fact that they stress this dimension to be citizen really becomes a mark of their urban identity. And it also goes back to another dimension, which is a conflict about modernity, which we have in Serbia. So this kind of urban activism is based on a discussion on what modernity is. And the activists very much criticize the modernity, or the notion of modernity that the city authorities and the city government employ. They say that, well, they might call it modernity, but that's just conservatism, it's just our backwards tradition, but not modernity in the way they perceive it. So I'm very thankful for your question, because underlying what we have in the urban activism, there are many layers of what is actually going on beneath it.
Thank you. Other questions? Well, I think that I have questions that are like growing from what Anna was asking about. And my first question was, when we were trying to compare the bike movement to other activist movements in Belgrade, are they kind of independent, separate from each other, or do they overlap, or the struggle for consolidation, or or at least are engaged in some kind of networking, which is often the case for St. Petersburg now, when very diverse Polish groups would suddenly back up together against the political elites or whatever. So that's one part of the question. And another one, you were bringing some examples of how the paradox comes of the bike movement having political claims but not declaring themselves political. But can you bring examples of which claims you do consider political and why?
Okay. Well,
because this politicization is very hard to operationalize sometimes, and find out where the social claims finish and the political ones start.
Okay. Starting with the question whether there is networking between the various urban movements, it is difficult to generalize that. There are some networks, but they are more or less interpersonal. So they are between certain groups of activists, but not on a broader basis. And the reason is that the activists simply don't trust each other. So distrust is a big barrier and a big issue when it comes to joining forces in order to put bigger pressure on the city authorities and to push forward their claims. And the thing is that many foreigners who live in Belgrade and are also engaged in that kind of urban activism, they always question why Belgraders do not cooperate, why the activists simply don't work together. And some activists explained that to me and said that, we know the kind of barriers that the city authorities are putting upon us. And every time when they perceive us in a negative way, when they perceive us as obstructive, they don't want to cooperate with us. So as soon as we have some partners who are perceived in a negative way by the city authorities, we would lose a standpoint. So it is difficult. Some of them use activities that might be perceived as illegal, like marking bike lanes with color, which would definitely cause problems if the police would catch them while doing that. But they do it very privately because they fear that as soon as they are caught, they have no possibility to enter negotiations with city authorities. So they do both these do-it-yourself actions and also try to lobby with city authorities, which is a paradox because on the other side they don't trust them. So they try to do everything which might serve their needs and their claims. And to the question where the social and the political starts, it's a good question. That is a very tough one.
Sorry, I'm asking because we face a very similar problem in our research. We have problems distinguishing. I thought probably you're faced with that too. I'm also always thinking about how to perceive what they do. It might be easier for me in the kind of activism for homeless people because here it really goes on the policy level. Here they try to get new policies that would recognize homelessness as an issue by which different sorts of social groups in Belgrade are affected by. So it's not only people who are sleeping rough, that means they don't have any roof over their head, but also other social groups like Roma, the Romani minority. So here it is easy for me to distinguish the political claims, which is much more difficult when it comes to the cyclists, because I think that it is that we have some interconnected claims which are social and political both, but I think I would have to think about it more. Okay, thank you. Other questions? because I can have a list.
May I just shortly intervene on this issue of social and political? It's a very important question for all of us, I believe. But I also struggled with it in my own papers, and there is a very nice definition. I think it was Hannah Arendt or someone who said that political starts when you start to sort of speak of a common good in your actions. When you decide that something is good for everyone in this city, then you enter this political domain.
But which level of generalization of common good is necessary?
Good question, I don't know.
Not in my backyard movement. Is it political because they're struggling for a shared common good, but at the level of the neighborhood, is it already
Yes,
political?
but I think it was another definition of the political, which is very instrumental and easy, but I don't know how it applies to the urban movements. It's the one by Charles Steele. When you sort of lobby the political decisions, you enter the political discussion, you work with the authorities, with the things like that, and then you are political. So in this case, cyclists are very political because if, as you said, they try to use any methods of this. It's not a fight with actually politics. I mean, if you write papers, if you speak to the public authorities, if you conduct public actions, then you are political.
Yeah, they do that really. They try to lobby, but sometimes they stop that lobbying process just because there are incidents where, again, the city authorities prove that they are not trustful, like during the Orange Bike event, where activists actually experienced once again how the city authorities look upon bike activists or cyclists' need. So then they start a new strategy, like doing illegal marking of bike paths, and then even within the bike community, it's not a consistent, homogeneous group, it's very heterogeneous. There are even fights within, not even between groups, but even within groups about what their standpoint actually is. So it's very difficult for them to enter a lobbying process because they don't have a backing of their own groups. So it's very much that one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing or should do. That's a little bit the way it is in Belgrade. And when it comes to the question of common good, it is very much contested what that common good should be, especially when cyclists, they are in numbers a minority, because Belgraders look upon them as freaks, crazy people. People very often do not understand why they take the bike, because driving a car is a status symbol. As you have also said it's the same in St. Petersburg, and there are even ads there's advertisement there was one national that was broadcast on national TV about lawns. So there was a young guy riding a bike, obviously showing that he was not affluent, he didn't have money, and after that lawn he was able to have a big car. And that was the message, that the car is something for people who are well off, who made it, and the bike is limited, associated with poor people. But it's getting a lifestyle, it's getting urban lifestyle now, which is a new topic in Belgrade. So it's getting fashionable, it's getting a style. And those who would like to see themselves as, the urban and young crowd are more and more using the bike because it's a fashion statement.
So people start seeing them less as freaks now? That's what you're saying?
Less and less. And also, that's also the message which cyclists try to bring out. They say that as soon more and more people are using the bike, no matter if it's just for statement or fashion reasons or not, we get more and more, and they have to respect us when we are in traffic. So they say that, well, it's a good process what is happening now, and actually there is there are some new fancy stores in Belgrade as well who take up the issue of bikes. So there's one bike cafe and one store where they make these fancy bikes. I mean, really fancy one. Not the one I would ride because it's too expensive, but yeah.
Oh, I also wanted to ask you a last question. Do you think, towards just the society in general, the Orange Revolution, how it was organized, do you think it really helped the image normal people, ordinary people had of cyclists, or not?
This
Orange. Yeah.
Orange bike event, okay.
Yeah.
You mean the orange bike? Okay.
Because the Orange Revolution.
Not the, but yeah, for me it's
Okay.
no, it sticks in my head. I always think of the Orange Revolution.
Yeah.
And with everything that's happening in Ukraine, I always mix it up.
Okay. Yeah, I was trying hard to make a connection between the Orange Revolution and Belgrade. And
No, just kidding. But
no.
The bike Orange Revolution, let's call it like that.
I would even doubt that we can call it a revolution in Belgrade, because I mean it was simply a single event.
Yeah.
The participants were people that go to the critical mass events, so they are already part of the bike scene. There were a lot of foreigners who are used to cycling in the towns where they come from, and since it was financially supported by the Embassy of the Netherlands, it was Dutch people and they are used to riding the bike in the Netherlands, so they enjoyed the possibility to actually bike in the city. But I would say that generally speaking, it didn't bring about any change in terms of broader society in Belgrade. I mean, it's still a culture of cars, it still is, but everyone knows that it is a step after the other that has to be taken. So it's cycling as a fashion statement, it's the critical mass events, and all these single temporary events play together to change something about cycling, and also then to put more pressure on the city authorities, because their standpoint is that, well, that was even articulated clearly. They said that, well, we don't have to build any bike infrastructure if there are no cyclists. But in another sense, as long as there is no bike infrastructure, no one will ride the bike in the city. So.
Can I then proceed with my question? Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask two small and probably very descriptive questions. One is whether in some way the bike activists use the rhetorics of Europeanization. Well, what I mean is that in St. Petersburg, like, Eric has written a lot in her papers, and we also found in our research, like every actor would refer to the image of Europe, because, you know, St. Petersburg claims to be the most European out of all Russian cities, and all actors would claim their will for St. Petersburg to become as European as possible, but they would give different definitions to being European. Like, for example, in the struggle for public spaces, the authorities would describe European as clean and, you know, ordered, and the people would probably imagine European public spaces as generally accessible when you can just lie on the grass and eat something, which like the authorities hate. And the same in our research in garage wars, where the authorities would want St. Petersburg to be European in sense, aesthetically appealing, which means no ugly spots of old garage stalls, whereas the garage owners would use the word European to describe the normal state with normal property rights. So, it's, and again, of course, it's a legend of how European is. And my question is, with this process of European integration, whether any of the actors would use this image of Belgrade to become more European or European-like, and how?
Yes. Well, the European integration is, in that sense, no topic, because Belgrade or Serbia has long been waiting for the membership talks to start. So there had been a lot of issues, and Serbia has been long on that waiting position. So people in Serbia got, on one hand, quite disappointed with the European Union, on the one hand. But when looking at Europe and the image of Europe, that it's very prominent in the activists' claims and also in the way they define their goals. So the image of Europe is used and is at the bottom of their notion of modernity. That's where they are heading to. So to be modern is to have Belgrade, or to develop Belgrade in a sense that it would become or look like more like a European city. And what they understand by it is, of course, bike infrastructure, and they lean towards other European cities in that sense. And very interesting is that when I talked to one of my informants, a bike activist, who said that Europe is very important for how we perceive biking and bike activism, and but we make differences. It's not Scandinavia we are looking to, because they are too much advanced. They are ahead of us. We are never able to reach that in the near future. So what we are looking at is Austria, Hungary, countries that are closer. And especially when it comes to Austria, there is the history of the Austrian monarchy, the empire, and the influence of the Austrian monarchy, especially in Novi Sad and in Belgrade. And this activist said that, you know, Austria is much more important for us because we used to be Austrian long time ago. You had a strong influence on our architecture and the way the city looks, so we better know what it is happening in Austria. And also cycling in Austria is okay from the perspective of Belgraders, but when looking from the Scandinavian countries, it's bad. I mean, we have in Vienna 4-point-somewhat percentage of Viennese people riding the bikes. It's still not that much, but for Belgraders, where only 0.2% of all the inhabitants ride the bike, it's a lot. So it is certain countries, cities they are looking at, and it's very much the notion of European is modern. So that is the kind of connection they make.
Because here the problem is that part of the group is sitting behind me, and therefore I'm always afraid of ignoring some questions. So you should shout if you want. So you spoke more about the more strategical action of, well, if we can speak about them strategical. However, it's more organized, more structured. How about the special tactics of activists in their everyday practices of mobility? Because you showed how, well, again, very similar pictures to what we have, like, you know, roads starting in the middle of nowhere and ending there, or like bad infrastructure and destroyed roads. Are there any tactics they use to kind of get adapted to this challenging environment? Are there any attempts from the activists or average cyclists to somehow, you know, be flexible with that, with the pressures of the space?
Of course, there are strategies which they use. Some of them they choose deliberately to take the middle of the street, so directly go into the traffic, and they say that only that ensures that they are seen. Even only if they are, you know, taking the middle of the road, they make sure that the car drivers really are aware of them. Even though that is perceived as not the securest choice, not the securest way. And on the other hand, a lot of people are also riding on the pedestrian ways, so and that is also connected to the fact that there is simply no bike infrastructure, and it's not perceived to be a safe matter to take the streets, so they take the pathways, and there of course they get in conflict with the pedestrians, and that's not the way it should be. So a lot of bike activists say that we shouldn't fight with the pedestrians, we should fight with the car drivers. If we have to fight with someone, then it's the car drivers. So
like a class enemy.
Yeah.
Brave guys fighting with bicycle against drivers.
That's maybe not the smartest decision, and they always say that there is even someone who has mounted a camera on his bike because he likes to record his bike trips and then put them on YouTube. And he recorded a lot of incidents where he was cut off by cars, by trucks, and a lot of cyclists actually say that it is insecure, it is very, very much unsafe, and a lot of conversations actually circle around the newest injuries. One told me that, I broke my arm during riding the bike, but the first thing he said to me was that was not due to a car accident, I was just falling from my bike. So if someone gets injured, it's whether due to a car, that is the common knowledge. But if it's not due to a car, then you have to, you really have to state that, because otherwise people would think it's due to an accident with a car.
And how about the, actually, two last points and that's it. So you guys, this is your last chance to think of a question, because I will repress you all otherwise discursively. And how about the structure of the activist movement? Do they have leaders? To which extent can the movement can be described as diverse, culturally and socially diverse, also by age or social status or gender? And to which extent do you think this homogeneity or heterogeneity would influence the potential of collective mobilization?
These are actually two big questions, because the question of leadership is highly contested. There is nearly always a head of any bike association, and I just go back to that slide with the bike actors. We have different associations which were founded. The oldest ones were founded in the one Jugendcycling-Kampagne in 1998, so that's the oldest one. And thus the members of this bike association is of course older than the members of Ulice za Bicykliste, which is the youngest one. So already from the membership status we have a difference in the age structure. When it comes to educational background, it is very often that we find highly educated people in these bike associations, so they have a university degree or are students, and that is the same with members from the older associations, although we also find younger people in the older associations now, so they are also entering these new ones, but mainly most of the young people just go to Ulice za Bicykliste because they are also known how to attract young people, because they are said to know how to have a good party. So it's also the critical mass and then social get-together, and it mostly ends in a party with a lot of alcohol, music, dancing.
Is it an advertisement? Is it an advertisement of the movement?
It's not, but I have to admit that, of course, when it comes to the critical mass events, I ended up at one or two of their parties, and it's much more fun to be there than to be at another event, which is alone from the age structure different. But besides the educational background, we also find that a lot of the people who are affiliated with these bike associations have been to other European cities or countries. So they have been there to visit friends, relatives, especially in Vienna. We have a big Serbian community in Vienna. And the Serbian community in Vienna is even that big that one of our streets, where a lot of Serbian cafes are, is called Balkanska ulica. Informally, that's not the real name, but that's the reference there. So people have been abroad, they have made experience in other European cities to know what it looks like there, and they want to bring that experience back to Serbia, because only due to the change of perspective they see or to perceive Belgrade different due to that experience in other countries. So being abroad is definitely has a big impact, and it definitely goes together with the drop of the visa regulations in Serbia, which now enabled a lot of people to leave the country without having to apply for a visa. And the question of leadership, I try to avoid it, I guess, but it is difficult because in the newest associations like Ulica za bicikliste, there have been some disputes over the question who is a leader. There was one young guy who was taking the lead informally. He did all the activities, he organized them, he did everything what was necessary to do, but others criticized him for becoming the leader, for representing and framing the activities too much. So they were saying that you did some things we would not have liked to do, to organize, so you just took the whole association in your own hands. But the fact is that there are some people who just criticize some others, but wouldn't take the lead. So the leadership is more or much contested, but is not within the older associations because they have a clear structure and their own board. So it's clear who is leading the association. But we don't have these clear structures in the younger ones, especially since most of them started off as informal groups of people, so they were not registered as an association.
Oh, my last small question of curiosity is about your fieldwork.
Yep.
You mentioned a bit already. So to be an anthropologist in the field of Belgrade and research bike activism means cycling a lot.
It meant riding the bike a lot, not only during organized events, but also with bike activists through the city, because I wanted to experience what it is like to ride a bike. That was the first thing. But also, it is kind of a strategy I deliberately used to ride the bike with my informants, because then on this bike ride they showed you things, and starting with these things they showed you, they started with stories, narratives, or rumors, which they had to tell me. I also did not only ride the bike, but also went on walking tours with my informants in order to perceive the way they see the city. And here we have the topic of space again, and the way Serbia is perceived in crisis is described and experienced by space through the city. So every time when we were riding the bikes, they showed me different things which were an example for them how much Serbia is actually in crisis.
Like go alone method of catastrophes. But what a risky profession of anthropologists, right? Okay, any other questions, remarks? So if you have one but you are too shy to ask, you can do so in the coffee break which we have now of 10 minutes. And you are welcome to join for coffee over there at the table. And after the break, we'll give the word for good. Thank you very much.